Good day to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather video for today, June 28th, Friday, 2024. We made it through the end of another week of this hurricane season, and it is turning into a very busy hurricane season now because we are in a very unusually active period for late June, and this is really what I want to drive home about today's video. We have three areas of interest now in the Atlantic, both of them, two of them in the MDR, and of course we have another one in the Caribbean, two of them as well being Invests. One of them obviously Invest 95L, which is well on its way to becoming a tropical system, tropical depression in the very least. Wouldn't shock me at all, actually, if it gets designated later today. So let's start off with a look at climatology, actually, because I want to show you what is normal for this time of year. And one thing I do want to point out, you could obviously see in the climatology map, this is a look at history in terms of what areas are most typical that we look for in development in the last 10 days of June. This is what that is for, since we're in the last 10 days of June right now. And you notice where all of these tropical points of origin are. They're all in the Western Caribbean, in the Gulf of Mexico, and in the general Western Atlantic region. And look out here in the MDR, we only tend to have one point of origin in the last 10 days of June. So generally, on average in June, the main areas of focus is the Western Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and off the East Coast, usually for weak, small spin-ups that we typically get. Usually it's not really much of anything strong that occurs in the last 10 days of June anyways, and they mostly tend to be in the Western Atlantic, closer to where we are, because that's where the water is usually warmest this time of year. We really don't take a look much at the MDR yet. But that is very much in contrast to what we have this year on June 28th. Honestly, if you were to tell me that this was June 28th in any normal year, I would have laughed at your face, because really June 28th, honestly, looking a lot more like August 28th right now in the National Hurricane Center homepage. Once again, we have three areas of interest. First off is Invest 94L in the Western Caribbean. Once again, I don't want to completely forget about this yet, because as I mentioned yesterday, and it still looks like the case today, this could still try to do something in the Bay of Campeche. But regardless, 94L will be a threat in terms of heavy rain and flash flooding. But the big talk of the town right now is this one right here, 95L in the Atlantic, and we're actually going to get to this one in a moment. But 95L right now, tropical system located 1,500 miles east-southeast of the Windward Islands, and it is gradually becoming better defined. National Hurricane Center gives this a 90% chance of formation within the next 48 hours, so this is very much likely on its way to becoming a tropical depression. And once again, in the Eastern Atlantic, where, as I just showed you, climatology-wise, we typically don't get much of anything that develops in this part of the Atlantic during this time of year. And to top that off, newly designated today, another area of interest, this time with a 20% chance. And this might be something that we need to start looking at potentially once we get 95L out of the way, in terms of potential impacts to the Caribbean islands associated with 95L, because this is very much looking like you guys in the Windward Islands might be dealing with potentially a tropical storm to maybe even a hurricane early next week out of what will be 95L, probably at this point, very certain almost, soon to be tropical storm Beryl eventually, although right now it is still only an Invest. So we have that, and we also have another area of interest in the MDR on top of that too. This is something that models are showing developing behind 95L. The bottom line is that activity is very much unusually active for this time of year, and it is something that is definitely having us all on edge, especially given the fact that this year was expected to be an active hurricane season. And now we're seeing the fruit of that. We're seeing two areas of interest in the MDR, and we have three areas of interest total in June. Very crazy indeed. And you can see that on the satellite image, and especially these two invests we have here, Invest 94L. Definitely trying this morning. You can see a little bit more of some sort of circulation trying to get going with it, although showers are still very disorganized. And this does have, I think, a little bit of shear. Some sort of upper level system, I think, is very weak one, but still one nonetheless that is imparting some shear on this. But 94L is there in the Caribbean, and obviously, regardless, it'll produce heavy rain and flash flooding concerns to Central America, on top of the fact that they have already had to deal with prior systems since last week, dumping lots of heavy rain with Alberto and then another area of invest that we had. And this is going to basically do the same thing as that. So that's going to be the biggest concern for Central America and its impacts regardless. So that will be the biggest concern from 94L. And then we have obviously 95L out here in the Eastern Atlantic, more or less Central Atlantic now, actually. And you could just see how defined it is. Really looks like, honestly, to me, you could already call this a tropical depression, and I would believe you. Very much a defined circulation in there, just waiting on the National Hurricane Center to potentially designate this once again, as I said, later today. And then we also have, to the east of that, more very intense tropical waves coming off Africa. I think the other area of interest is probably with the wave that is in here. So there's just a lot of energy coming off Africa, and it is all fighting against the climatology aspect of it, which is the Saharan air to the north. And it is very, very much surprising and astounding that despite we have this part of the typical dry Saharan air that we have to the north, we have things on the south end of that in the MDR still trying despite that. And it really just once again proves the fruitfulness of the very favorable atmosphere we have for this hurricane season. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more in just a moment. But really quickly, let's take a look at the 850 millibar vorticity map to get an idea of what both of these systems look like. And this map is really neat because you could really pick out the features in terms of what you actually see in terms of its circulation that you really can't always see. You definitely can see with the satellite, but you really can take a look at it in terms of an actual perspective on how defined its circulation is with the 850 millibar vorticity. And by the way, 850 millibars, this product is basically looking at the vorticity and spin in the atmosphere roughly 5,000 feet up, I believe, from the surface. But the bottom line, this is a look at the spin in the atmosphere, and you can see with 95L, notice how compact, tight, and also defined the vorticity is here. This is definitely the signature that we're looking for in terms of a developing, if not once again already, tropical system. So this is definitely on its way to become our next named storm, and definitely most likely a depression later today. And you can even see 94L as well in the Caribbean, definitely trying, at least with its circulation, a little bit more today. Models are starting to pick up on that, and I'll show you in a little bit, but it does seem like, once again, the models do try to do something with 94L once it gets into the Bay of Campeche, roughly, I think, tomorrow-ish or so. So there's our two areas of interest, definitely both defined, especially 95L. Let's see how that actually translates to the models that we have today with the GFS, the 12Z running right now. You can see initialize, you can see the area of where 95L is. Let's take it out into time. And there you go by hour 24. So this is roughly this time, a little bit earlier, tomorrow morning. Definitely already a bona fide tropical system. Looks like it'll probably be a tropical storm by then. So we have that, and we move it out into time, moves it through the MDR roughly at hour 60. This is Monday. Definitely looks like a developed system heading into the islands. Seems like impacts occur Monday afternoon into the evening, and then we have that system moving on out into the Caribbean as we head into mid next week. And it looks like this run, it crashes it into Hispaniola, and then it kind of disrupts it a little bit. So the GFS has a bona fide system with 95L moving into the Caribbean. And I think that's the bigger takeaway than what the actual intensity that the GFS shows, because if we dwell on that, we're going to dwell on a whole bunch of fear and craziness, because the GFS does actually make this a quite bona fide system. The upper levels, once again, are very favorable, and so are the actual sea surface temperatures on the surface. But the biggest point is that right there at Monday, so this is Monday afternoon, the GFS has a bona fide tropical system heading into the Windward Islands, which will probably bring impacts, at least tropical storm force. And if we actually take a look at the real intensity of the GFS, the GFS at least thinks that it could indeed actually be hurricane impacts. So let's say those are the islands of Grenada, St. Lucia, Barbados too, I think is to the northern part of it. And I think there's also St. Vincent in there as well. Those islands, all of the Windward Islands, that's what the GFS shows. The biggest part now is also what the other models show, because there's one model that shows one thing, but then we also need to look at the other models to see if all of them agree. And the European, a little bit on a weaker solution, the European doesn't quite amplify 95L as strongly as the GFS does, but there we are, Monday afternoon, so this is roughly hour 84 from the 60 European, so this was run at 60, so this is roughly 6 hours behind in terms of its initialization and everything. But it's still the same thing. The European shows bona fide tropical system moving into the Caribbean islands, although it's weaker, probably a tropical storm on this run of the European. But the biggest agreement I think that we need to pay attention for is that if we look at the European, and then let's go back to the GFS, they both have a developing and probably solid tropical system heading into the Windward Islands on Monday afternoon. And that is significant because it is models agreeing on us potentially having a tropical system impacting islands where there is civilization. And regardless of whether or not it is a tropical storm or a hurricane, it will bring impacts regardless. So you folks in the islands, if you have interests in the islands, especially the Windward Islands, or if you are watching from the Windward Islands, you should start getting ready, get your hurricane plan prepared, and you should definitely keep an eye onto the tropics with 95L, because it definitely looks like we will have some sort of solid system moving through that area rough around Monday, so early next week. The intensity is very much variable, because if you do notice both the GFS and the European, you do notice one thing about 95L. It is a small system, and that's partially it really swings it either way. And I'll show you with the relative humidity, because this is a very small system. It remains in the southern MDR, and the plus side of that is that it's able to remain a moisture bubble around it, as you can see from the relative humidity on the GFS. Notice all of these greens represent the atmosphere being moist and being primed for convective activity, and these greens is what you want to see when you see if you're talking about atmosphere that is thermodynamically favorable for convection and things like that. And the GFS shows definitely that this storm is small. It has a moisture bubble around it, and that's able to shield it from all of this brown and orange, which is Saharan air to the north of it, and that helps the GFS also amplify this storm tremendously. The GFS is known to be aggressive with storms like this, but regardless, it is showing that that this storm has very favorable conditions ahead of it. And that is something that we need to watch. Although it goes both ways, because while yes, this storm is small and the GFS has a moisture bubble with it, which, because of the fact that it's small, its impact, it's compact, and it is able to keep away from most of the dry air to the north. But because it's small, any sort of entrainment of this dry air could also swing it completely to the other side. Instead of the GFS showing a really strong solution, we could end up having something like maybe what the European shows, which actually this is a really good comparison, because you notice on the European, definitely not as strong of a moisture bubble associated with it, probably meaning lots more dry air being entrained to it, which results in a weaker solution that the European shows. And that makes sense. So it really goes either way with this system, and it really depends on how well it's able to organize and how well it's able to take advantage of the atmospheric part of the favorability that this storm has. And I'll show you that really quickly with the 200 millibar wind. So the upper level wind in the atmosphere. The GFS has this amplifying really quite a bit, because notice as it's on approach to the islands, as it's intensifying very quickly, the upper level winds are moving away from 95L, which means that there is outflow associated with the storm. Notice by these, the flow of the wind moving away from the storm and also moving eastward as well, meaning that there are upper level easterlies in the atmosphere too. So generally things are moving away in the upper levels from the system, so 95L is able to breathe. It's also able to create its own little environment around itself, and the upper level atmosphere is generally favorable for intensification of 95L. And top that off, when we look at the sea surface temperatures, when we're looking at the ground aspect of what 95L has below it, this is the sea surface temperature anomaly map from the NOAA Coral Reef Watch, and right through the southern MDR, right into the eastern Caribbean, you notice where the track of 95L is supposed to be, sea surface temperature anomalies are averaging, and it just goes to show the crazy part of how favorable we're looking at this year. And this does not only applies to 95L, but just generally how warm the Atlantic this year. It's really going to work in 95L's favor, because solidly we have at least 1, even 2 degrees Celsius anomalies above normal of the sea surface temperatures that are in the MDR. So that means lots of extra heat for 95L to work with, lots of potential for quick intensification, and the GFS shows that really well with a very favorable scenario, which allows 95L to intensify a lot to what the GFS shows. And once again, just want to show the track guidance. It moves right through the southern MDR, and it also has lots of confidence as well by all the models that that's the track that we're going to see. And this is a part that I mentioned yesterday that I thought was really interesting about 95L, is the fact that a lot of the models are really confident on the track of this system, especially as it heads through the Caribbean. And I think it's a really important thing when it comes to the confidence of forecasting where this storm is going to hit, which is really important because this will be moving through the southern Caribbean islands where there is civilization and there are people that are wondering what exactly the impacts will be like for them. So there's lots of confidence that it'll really be right through the southern Caribbean. And once again, also through the very warm waters of the southern MDR. So just really quickly, looking at the track, you see it's right through the southern MDR and right through on the sea surface temperature anomaly map, waters that are anomalously warm as much as a degree or 2 Celsius above where they should be with the long-term average. And that lasts all the way through the Caribbean. So that is very much significant indeed. And the fact that we also have La Nina, well, not quite La Nina yet, but we have no El Nino. We don't have any sort of El Nino influence or any sort of long-standing features in the world sort of circulation that is impeding on this system developing. We have neutral conditions, and we're going towards La Nina, and that obviously favors the atmosphere in the Atlantic a lot more. The bottom line is just things are very favorable for the system, and the intensity guidance is picking up on this too. We talked about this yesterday, but the majority of the intensity guidance takes this at least to hurricane strength. If we look at all these intensity model plots, only 2 of them don't make this at least a hurricane. I wouldn't focus yet on what exactly the intensity of this storm will be, because that is still very much dependent on what it does and how it uses the atmosphere, the general environment that it has ahead of it. But if you're watching from the islands, once again, GFS does fall in line with all the other model guidance and showing that this is a solid hurricane, potentially on approach to the islands. So this might be a concern that we need to watch for, and it certainly goes to really plays into the idea of how unusual the activity is that we're seeing for late June into early July, because we typically don't get any sort of development in this part of the Atlantic, let alone the potential of that development becoming a hurricane while it's in the MDR on approach to the islands. We really only see this in seasons that we have seen this really do tend to be extraordinarily and historically active. And this year is following in those footsteps, and it definitely looks like it is going to be a very active and interesting season ahead for sure. And 95L is definitely a sign of what is to come in the future. So with that being said, I'm going to end it off for today. Lots to go over and lots to watch for with 95L in the future. We definitely got to see how things progress, but it's certainly looking interesting, especially if you're in the islands. Watch this closely and definitely get your preparations ready and start preparing right now, and obviously don't wait till it's too late. With that being said, stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to you all. I'll do an update today again if indeed, and probably when this does get designated 95L as an actual tropical system, because I do believe it's going to happen. And once it does so, I will post another update today, so stay tuned for that. With that being said, though, I'm going to end it off for today. Stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we'll talk again very soon.